Using the same method, George Xu helped Greg Wang register at the provincial office, demanding that surrounding counties and cities immediately dispatch personnel to investigate the situation in their respective areas. After arranging this, Greg Wang inquired about the condition of Jasmine Gan's grandmother and grandson, who were visited in the hospital by his subordinates yesterday. Part of the purpose was also to find out from the grandmother if anyone had visited their home recently. However, the answer he received was irrelevant to the case, indicating that the grandmother really did not know who sought revenge for the Gan family. Jacqueline accompanied Greg Wang to visit the Imperial Garden once again, as Greg Wang still had an unsolved mystery in his mind. How did the murderer know Vincent Fan's exact address? One possibility was an acquaintance, but according to the statements of Vincent Fan's children, aside from relatives, only a few leaders from certain units knew the exact location of the Fan residence. The murderer sought revenge for the Gan family, and it was highly unlikely that this murderer was a close relative or friend of Vincent Fan. Moreover, Vincent Fan's children mentioned that their family did not know anyone involved in chemistry. The only other possibility was stalking, but Imperial Garden, aside from allowing newspaper and milk delivery workers in early in the morning, did not permit entry to outsiders. Vincent Fan would not return home early in the morning. And if Vincent Fan was followed after work, the visitor would have to register at the entrance of the community, by which time Vincent Fan's car would have already entered. By the time the murderer finished registering and entered the community, Vincent Fan would have already parked his car in a garage outside the villa, out of sight, making it impossible for the murderer to know which house belonged to Vincent Fan. Moreover, Vincent Fan's car was checked, and no tracking devices were found, ruling out this possibility as well. Greg Wang paced back and forth outside Vincent Fan's villa, looking around over and over again, confirming that there was nothing on the exterior of the villa that could reveal the identity of the homeowner. Greg Wang frowned and looked up at the sky around him. This was a suburban area with no tall buildings nearby, making it impossible to use the terrain to observe the community's environment. At that moment, his gaze turned to the mountain behind the community, putting himself in the murderer's shoes, and an idea formed in his mind. If I were the murderer, where would I choose to track Vincent Fan? Indeed, the mountain in front of him. The mountain was not high, and one could see a pavilion on it, as well as a man-made stone path. It seemed like a place where people would go for morning exercises. He went to the community's entrance to ask the security guard, who confirmed that some middle-aged and elderly people would go up the mountain for exercise in the morning and evening. He nodded, pondered for a moment, and although not entirely sure, decided to dispatch 2 police officers to ask the mountain climbers early the next morning, perhaps they would discover something. Thus, he rushed back to the police station, called 2 young police officers, and assigned them the task of climbing the mountain early the next morning, and to ask the people exercising there if they had seen anyone using binoculars or similar devices to observe the area below in the recent past. He even found this idea incredible. If the murderer was meticulous to this extent, planning to observe the terrain from the mountain, how terrifyingly meticulous his entire criminal plan must be. But if the murderer did not use this method to find out about Vincent Fan's home, he could not think of any better explanation. The next day at noon, while Greg Wang was discussing the case with George Xu in the office, the 2 police officers from yesterday knocked on the door and entered, their faces serious but excited. Greg Wang didn't wait for them to speak, immediately standing up excitedly. "Did you find out?" One of the slightly older police officers immediately seized the opportunity to flatter, "Boss, you're too amazing." The murderer really was observing Imperial Garden from the mountain. A hint of unexpected joy flashed across George Xu's face, looking at Greg Wang with satisfaction. When Greg Wang mentioned this to him yesterday, he was skeptical, not believing that a criminal would climb a mountain to clearly see the structure and layout of the crime scene, as if preparing for a battle. He thought the murderer must have learned of it through some other means, perhaps mentioned by an acquaintance of Vincent Fan, an acquaintance who of course wouldn't remember now, but the murderer kept it in mind. If the murderer, like preparing for a battle, went to the mountain to overlook the overall situation and investigate the environment for the meticulousness of the crime plan, such an opponent would be too terrifying. However, since Greg Wang ordered to check, he did not oppose it. Currently, aside from investigating the milk box, the police force continued to repeatedly review past surveillance footage, always without progress, feeling helpless and at a loss. So, it was good to send 2 police officers to ask around. Unexpectedly, this inquiry revealed the true face of the murderer. The police officer continued, 2 or 3 old men all remember, about half a month ago, they saw someone on the mountain using a binocular with a stand to observe something. They were curious and asked him what he was looking at, and he said he was admiring the scenery below. But one evening when they were exercising, they found that person there again. Although they found it strange, they didn't think much of it. Greg Wang urgently asked, "Do those old men still remember what this person looked like?" At that time, they were curious, so they chatted with that person for a while and had an impression of him. The man was about 50 years old. Wait, 50 years old? Greg Wang interrupted. Yes. Greg Wang and George Xu exchanged puzzled looks, wondering how it could be a 50-year-old. Jasmine Gone was only 35. How could the murderer seeking revenge for her be so old? Could it be a university professor who had a relationship with Jasmine Gone back then? But universities were much cleaner 10 years ago, with very few cases of teacher-student relationships, and the preliminary investigation also did not reveal any teachers who were close to Jasmine Gone. He still put aside his confusion, waiting to continue listening. The man was about 50 years old, with a crew cut, but balding around the forehead, round-faced, dark-skinned, a fat man, very short, about 1.65 meters tall. A short, round-faced, dark-skinned, fat man of 1.65 meters? Yes, that's how they described him. Greg Wang nodded and continued, "Did you ask those old men what time they went up the mountain and encountered this guy?" "We asked. They usually exercise in the morning around 5:30, reaching the summit around 6 o'clock. The fat man was near the middle of the mountain, so they probably encountered him before 6 a.m. And in the evening? It gets dark early in winter. They usually go up the mountain around 5 p.m., stay at the summit for a while, and generally descend before 6 p.m. They saw that man still there when they came down. So, it means the fat man was already on the mountain before 5 a.m. and still there after 6 p.m. No wonder he was so familiar with the environment of Imperial Garden, not only knowing Vincent Fan's residence, but even knowing that the Fan family ordered milk. Greg Wang pursed his lips, looked up and thought for a while, and said, "You've got the contact information of those old men, right?" "Got it." "Then please ask them to come to the county bureau to assist in the investigation, and arrange for technical personnel to draw the facial features of the fat man this afternoon." "Okay, I'll go right away." After the 2 police officers left, Greg Wang paced back and forth, shaking his head in confusion. The criminal is 50 years old? This age gap with Jasmine Gone is too big. What could be the relationship? George Xu frowned and said, "The relationship between the murderer and the Gone family, before we catch the murderer, is just speculation. What I can't figure out is, the fat man on the mountain is only 1.65 meters tall, while the fat man in the surveillance footage is over 170 centimeters tall. The difference is too much. Could it be that the fat man on the mountain scouting is not the same fat man in the surveillance, but an accomplice?" Greg Wang also couldn't understand this question, so the 2 could only wait in the office for news. In the evening, Jacqueline ran in to report. "Boss, George, the facial feature sketch of the murderer failed." Greg Wang frowned and asked, "Is it because the witnesses can't remember clearly?" Jacqueline nodded, "Yes, the old men thought for a long time but couldn't recall what the murderer's face looked like. They said they didn't pay special attention at the time, and the person had a very ordinary appearance, with no features that would make him memorable. Even if they met him face to face on the street, they probably wouldn't be able to recognize him." George Xu said, "That's normal. In most cases, witnesses' recollections of the criminal's facial features are unreliable unless there are distinctive features due to facial deformities. Besides, it's about recalling a stranger they encountered half a month ago. Now that we have another clue, there will be gains as we continue to investigate." Greg Wang thought for a moment and said, "Right, Captain Lin, ask those old men to recall the exact date they encountered the fat man on the mountain, and then immediately collect all surveillance footage from the roads near the foot of the mountain. If the murderer didn't drive directly to the foot of the mountain, it's very likely that there will be surveillance footage showing his face. The opponent definitely didn't expect us to investigate up to the mountain, and since this was just his preliminary scouting phase, he probably wouldn't wear a mask at ordinary times." The next afternoon, Jacqueline rushed into the office, urgently saying, "Boss, the clue about the milk box has been cleared up." Greg Wang immediately stood up excitedly, "So quickly there's a result." Yes, it was the police in the city who found it. The milk box was manufactured by a small mold factory in the city, and the order was placed by a mold shop in the city. George Xu smiled and said, "Tomorrow is New Year's Day. The police also want to finish their work early and take a holiday. It's been less than 2 days, and there's already a result." Greg Wang asked, "The city comrades have already found out clearly?" "Yes, it was found yesterday afternoon. The factory owner, the daily manager, and the mold shop owner were all taken back to the station, and the results were obtained overnight." "What's the situation?" "The murderer went to the mold shop in the city about 2 weeks ago, gave the shop owner the dimensions of a box, and copied the pattern needed to be printed on the box to the shop owner using a USB drive, asking him to make it as soon as possible. The person claimed to be the regional procurement manager of a milk company needing to order a batch of new milk boxes, negotiated the price for bulk orders with the shop owner, and finally asked him to make a sample first." "Did the murderer leave a phone number?" Jacqueline shook his head. "He asked the shop owner how long it would take to complete, and the shop owner said within 2 days, asking him to leave a phone number so he could be notified when it was done. He said there was no need to leave it, and he would come to pick it up in 2 days, leaving a deposit of 300 yuan before leaving. The next day in the afternoon, the person arrived on time, paid the remaining 200 yuan, and took the box away." "Does the shop owner remember what that person looked like?" "The shop owner's description is similar to that of the old men yesterday. The person was a dark-skinned fat man, quite short, about 1.65 meters tall, with a crew cut, showing signs of balding, aged about 40 or 50, with small eyes, and a clear voice when speaking. Additionally, the shop owner remembered that the person seemed to be in poor health, occasionally frowning and pressing his temples with his hand. At one point, he turned his back, took something out of his pocket, swallowed it, and drank a few sips of water. The shop owner saw it was a white pill, so he had a deep impression of this memory. But when the city bureau's technical personnel asked him to assist in drawing the facial features, they encountered the same problem. After all, this person appeared 2 weeks ago, and the shop owner meets so many people every day. Besides the few obvious features mentioned above, the other facial features were very ordinary, and he couldn't imagine them." Greg Wang curled his lips and scratched his head. "Do they have surveillance in their shop?" Jacqueline shook his head, "No." "What about the other shops nearby? Or on the street?" "The comrades from the city bureau are looking into it. This is all the information we have for now." Greg Wang nodded. Nowadays, many shops have surveillance cameras, and he didn't believe that not a single camera caught that fat man. The case has made significant progress in the past few days, and he believed that it wouldn't be long before the murderer's true face would be revealed. "Humph, even though you criminals are very careful, even killing from a distance, you will still lose in the end. You are only 2 people, but there are hundreds of police officers looking for you." After Jacqueline left, Greg Wang sat back down in his chair and closed his eyes to think. George Xu also closed his eyes to rest, deep in thought. After a while, Greg Wang suddenly opened his eyes and said, "Boss, I almost forgot something." George Xu puzzled, "What?" "In the previous 3 cases, didn't we find out that the preliminary work for the crimes was all done by that fat man? Including tracking Li, visiting Li Gang's neighborhood for reconnaissance, and disguising as a milk delivery worker to enter the Imperial Garden for reconnaissance." "Yes, that's correct. The fat man seen on the mountain was also doing reconnaissance work." So, the fat man on the mountain, the fat man who ordered the milk boxes, and the fat man wearing a mask we caught on our surveillance must be the same person. George Shue thought for a moment and nodded. Yes, that makes sense. What's the biggest difference between the fat man we caught on our surveillance and the fat man described by the witnesses? What is it? George Shue thought for a few seconds, then suddenly widened his eyes. It's the height. Right, exactly, it's the height. The fat man caught on surveillance is between 170 to 174 centimeters tall, but the fat man seen by the witnesses is 165 centimeters tall. You can only make your height appear taller, not shorter. The fat man's real height is 165 centimeters. He must have deliberately worn height-increasing shoes during the crime, so he deliberately appeared in the surveillance footage. The purpose was to mislead our judgment, making us look for people taller than 170 centimeters, never thinking that the real height of the murderer is only 165 centimeters. This way, even if the fat man walked past our police officers during their investigation, they would immediately exclude him based on his height. George Shue nodded vigorously. You're right. Go check with the City Bureau's imaging experts to see if it's possible that the fat man in the surveillance was wearing height-increasing shoes. 2 hours later, the City Bureau called Greg Wang to tell him that they couldn't rule out the possibility that the fat man was wearing height-increasing shoes. The conclusion about the fat man's height was made by repeatedly comparing the figure in the footage with the surrounding objects and the angle of the surveillance camera, and it was very precise. But now it's winter, and the fat man was wearing a coat. It's impossible to judge the proportion of his upper and lower body from the surveillance footage. Moreover, because the fat man's knees couldn't be seen bending as he walked, it was also impossible to determine the length of his legs. This way, if the fat man wore a pair of shoes with hidden heels, it's entirely possible that they were deceived. The police would never dream that the criminal would consider the factor of height, deliberately wear a pair of height-increasing shoes, and specifically appear in the surveillance footage, all just to mislead the police's investigation direction. Understanding this issue, Greg Wang also instantly realized why the fat man risked deliberately leaving his image in the surveillance footage. It wasn't because he was particularly arrogant, challenging the police, but because he was extremely meticulous, covering every detail of the crime, even guessing the possible direction of the police investigation in advance. So, the police searched through all the men with heights between 170 to 174 centimeters from the past few years around Jasmine Gone, but they didn't find any suspicious individuals. So, is the fat man really a classmate of Jasmine Gone? If so, why did the witness say the person looked to be in their 40s or 50s? Of course, it could be because some people look older than their age. It's not rare for someone in their 20s to look like they're in their 40s. Maybe it's due to working in the chemical industry, which has a significant impact on the body. All right, it's necessary to investigate Jasmine Gone's classmates again. The workload this time won't be very large, because there aren't many people who are particularly short. Greg Wang turned his gaze towards the stack of medical reports of Jasmine Gone's male classmates from the past 5 years on his desk. He first took out the stack from Jasmine Gone's class, flipped through it, and finally selected 7 reports of male students who were shorter than 170 centimeters. The shortest one, on the top of the stack, had 2 words printed on the cover: Chase Chin. Greg Wang looked at Chase Chin's name, seeming to remember something. After recalling for a while, he remembered that Chase was Xander Su's childhood friend, who had been in the United States for many years and lost contact. He had tried calling the number he was given, but it had been disconnected, and he couldn't get in touch. Now is the exclusion phase of the investigation, and no possibility can be overlooked. He flipped open the medical report and saw Chase Chen's photo. He was a very thin guy, appearing to be a person lacking confidence. Coupled with his unattractive facial features, he even looked somewhat sleazy. However, this person had dark skin and small eyes. Well, he didn't rule out the possibility. He then flipped through the other medical reports. Some had dark skin, some had light, some had big eyes, some had small, but he didn't exclude any of them. Because the appearance of skin and eye size, these superficial features, a decade of time is enough to make a person undergo profound changes. The focus is still on whether each person has a solid alibi during the time of the crimes. With a large police force working overtime, the work progressed very quickly. On the third day of the new year, Jacqueline came to report, "Boss, we've checked the surveillance cameras near the mountain behind the Imperial Garden and couldn't find the target suspect. Since there's no surveillance at the foot of the mountain, it's impossible to determine whether the murderer came on foot, drove, or took a taxi." Greg One nodded in disappointment. "What about the mold shops in the city?" Jacqueline's face showed a joyful smile. "Combining the surveillance from nearby shops and intersections, we can almost confirm that the murderer came in a Mercedes. We checked the Mercedes, and it was a car with fake plates, so it's impossible to know the real license plate." Later, the comrades from the City Bureau checked the highway surveillance from the county to the city and successfully got a clear image of the suspect from the highway cameras. Greg Wine was overjoyed. "Quick, let me see." Jacqueline took out a color printout from his file bag, and Greg Wine and George Shue hurried over to look. In the center of the photo was a Mercedes, and through the car window, the driver's facial features could be clearly seen. The vehicle was in high-speed motion, and only the high-definition cameras used for capturing traffic violations on the highway could capture the murderer's face so clearly. The skin was dark, and it was difficult to distinguish the size of the eyes, but there was a lot of flesh on the face, obviously a fat man, and the forehead was partially bald, looking indeed to be in his 40s or 50s. And he was driving a car with fake plates. "No doubt, it was him," Jacqueline said. "The photo has been confirmed by the mold shop owner. It's this person." Greg Wine couldn't help but clap his hands, praising, "Good, well done this time. With this photo, we can catch this guy with a dragnet." Jacqueline excitedly said, "Boss, shall we post a wanted notice immediately?" Greg Wang and George Shue looked at each other, and George Shue shook his head. "No rush, it's better to figure out this person's identity first, then it'll be easier to catch." Jacqueline asked puzzledly, "Why not directly issue a nationwide arrest warrant? With this photo, it's going to be hard to determine his identity directly, right?" George Shue shook his head. "Our investigation phase is almost over, and next is the arrest work. Arresting might not be easier than the investigation phase. Our opponent this time is very smart and very cunning. If we directly post a nationwide arrest warrant and spook him, he might disguise himself and flee. In that case, in a sea of people, if there's no informant, it's going to be very hard for us to catch him in a short time. Now we don't even know who he is. Once he flees, even if he escapes back to his hometown, we wouldn't know. The best method is to figure out his identity, so we can also find out his hideout. This case has a big impact. We not only need to solve it but also catch the criminal, otherwise, in the eyes of our superiors, you would still be unsuccessful." Jacqueline frowned, "But now all other leads have been checked, and we only got this photo in the end. The real source of the car with fake plates is hard to trace, and just with the photo, it's hard to determine the identity." George Shue gently shook his head, picked up the photo again, and looked at it several times. "We haven't finished checking all our leads. The most important link of Jasmine Gaughan's classmates hasn't ended yet. The moment I got this photo, I felt like I've seen this person before. Now thinking about it carefully, it seems to be one of Jasmine Gaughan's classmates we looked at a few days ago." Greg One quickly picked up the medical reports, flipped through them all, and his gaze slightly narrowed, focusing on Chase Chen's photo. "He used to be skinny, now he's fat, but this nose looks exactly the same." George Shue pointed firmly at the photo. "It's very likely this guy." Seeing the similarity between the image captured by the highway camera and Chase Chen's photo from 10 years ago, Greg Wang immediately thought of Xander Sue. Right, Xander Sue mentioned that he was Jasmine Gaughan's ex-boyfriend. Could it be the mastermind is Xander Sue, and Chase Chen, his childhood friend, came to help him commit the crimes? But it shouldn't be. Xander Sue is a public servant, his fiancée is the only daughter of their director, young and beautiful. Xander Sue himself has a smooth career, a bright future. Would he commit these heinous crimes for a girlfriend from many years ago? Greg One frowned, keeping this suspicion in his heart for now. After all, without evidence, it's not good to casually suspect a colleague from a brother unit, and further investigation is needed. He thought for a moment, then found Leo Lu's phone number and dialed it. Today, Leo Liu was off work and still at home. When he picked up the phone and heard it was Greg Wang, he couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat. The last time the Jean County Public Security Bureau made a fuss, he was unjustly restricted for a few days, and because the police also searched his workplace, causing rumors among the staff that he had committed a big crime. Afterwards, 2 employees resigned and left, making his work and life a mess. Now Greg Wang was calling him again. What could happen? Although he was reluctant to answer the phone, he didn't dare to neglect, so he asked, "Director Wang, what's the matter?" Greg Wang apologized straightforwardly. "Mr. Liu, I'm very sorry about last time, causing you a few days of trouble. Please forgive me." Leo Liu hurriedly said, it's okay. Cooperating with the police investigation is the duty of us citizens." Greg Wang smiled and didn't beat around the bush, directly asking, "Mr. Liu, do you remember Chase Chin?" "Chase Chin? Who is Chase Chin?" He couldn't remember at the moment.